NPR Legal Affairs, I'm Louis Bryant, and today we take you inside the Supreme Court, or at least our classroom simulation of it, where the justices heard a case with surprisingly high stakes for the future of press freedom. The case is Associated Press v. Budowich, a dispute born from an unusual and an unusually political decision by the White House. After the Associated Press refused to adopt the administration's preferred term for the Gulf of Mexico, rebranded by the president as the Gulf of America, the AP was removed from the White House press pool, and the question presented to the court was simple but explosive. Can the government use access to the White House as leverage to influence how journalists report the news? Background of the case. The Associated Press argued that its exclusion was not about logistics or security, but viewpoint discrimination, punishment for its editorial judgment. In their view, it wasn't merely an access dispute. It was the government tying press access to political conformity. And while there's supposed to be a petitioner advocating for the administration's position, that advocate did not show up. Arguing on behalf of the Associated Press was Jeremy, who opened with a sweeping First Amendment claim that once the government opens its doors to the press, it cannot push a news outlet for refusing to endorse political messaging. Journalists don't work for the president, he said, and the First Amendment doesn't allow the executive branch to treat editorial disagreements as disloyalty. Then, Justice Kagan immediately honed in on the heart of the issue. Cancel, what's the strongest theory here? Compelled speech, retaliation, or viewpoint discrimination, he said. Jeremy chose compelled speech, insisting that forcing a newsroom to adopt the term Gulf of America was pressure on editorial choice, something that the court has long forbidden. Justice Alito, however, pushed back. If we start policing every exclusion from the White House, aren't we inviting a flood of litigation every time a reporter loses their seat? Jeremy tried to distinguish his case. He said, this wasn't about ordinary logistics. It was about punishing dissent. A line must exist, he argued, between managing access and controlling coverage. Justice Sotomayor raised a more modern issue. He said, suppose I'm a Facebook influencer covering the White House. Do I get the same rights as the AP? Jeremy said, yes, access shouldn't be dependent on ideology, popularity, or political alignment. He said, it's both a discrimination issue and a First Amendment violation. Justice Gorsuch dug into the factual dispute at hand. He asked, are you denying the administration's stated reasoning or the underlying facts? And Jeremy didn't fully commit either way, a moment where the justice clearly seemed unconvinced. Representing the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press, Ben, the amicus, offered perhaps the most compelling point of the day. The idea was that when access depends on adopting government-preferred language, it chills not one outlet, but every outlet. That's how censorship starts, he argues, not with a ban, but with a nudge. Justice Barrett asked whether the newsroom had changed behavior since AP's exclusion. The amicus admitted, there's no concrete evidence, but a palpable climate of fear. That admission drew some raised eyebrows. Justice Thomas, in a rare, lengthy question, asked, how do we know this isn't just normal evolution in press coverage? The amicus conceded it's difficult to separate natural change from retaliatory pressure, but argued that the White House's own statements were the smoking gun. The court's concerns. The justices wrestled with several recurring questions. Where does presidential discretion end? How do courts categorize censorship versus legitimate access management? Does excluding the AP harm public access to information? And internationally, does the US have any authority to unilaterally rename the Gulf? In one striking moment, Justice Jackson invoked the United Nations position that no nation has jurisdiction over the Gulf of Mexico. If the US can simply rename territory for political reasons, she warned, what stops the executive from doing the same with the press? This point underscores the respondent's central warning, that if the executive can unilaterally redefine geographic reality for political gain, it can just as easily manipulate the informal landscape, turning press access from a constitutional safeguard into a tool of ideological enforcement. At the end of the arguments, and despite uneven performances, the justices clearly sensed the larger implications, being access to the White House press pool is the public's window into the executive branch, and when that access is tied to political loyalty, democracy itself is in danger. And yet, despite these concerns, the court in our simulation ultimately ruled 3-6 against the Associated Press, effectively endorsing broad executive control over press pool access. But this decision doesn't resolve any of the constitutional tensions, it only sharpens them. The question now is whether future administrations might see this precedent as permission to blur the line between press management and press manipulation. I fear that this ruling leaves future administrations with a far wider berth to reward friendlier coverage and sideline critical voices, which will reshape not just who gets into the briefing room, but what the public ultimately gets to know. What the case leaves us with is a reminder. The First Amendment isn't just about protecting speech, it's about protecting the conditions that allow journalists to ask hard questions in the first place. For NPR Legal Affairs, I'm Louis Bryant. This has been Associated Press v. Budowich.